So, hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining in tonight. Tonight we are having a special guest. We are having Ajahn Punnadhammo from Arrow River Forest Hermitage in Canada. And thank you so much, Ajahn, for coming to the channel. We're so happy to have you. So nice to see you. And tonight, thank you for coming. Tonight is the first time that Ajahn is on the channel. People who are watching, you might have seen some recordings of him before on the channel, but today is the first time that he's live. And we are all very excited. And Ajahn will give a series of talks on dependent origination. And today is the first episode of his talks. So without further ado, Ajahn, please go ahead. And we are all very excited and looking forward to your talk.
Okay. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. So, happy to be here this evening and speaking with you all. What I propose to cover this evening is a basic introduction to the concept of paticca samuppada, dependent arising, and its important place in the Buddhist teaching. The general proposition for the dependent arising is given in the formula, this being that exists, through the arising of this, that arises. This not being, that does not exist, through the ceasing of this, that ceases. That's found in the Samyutta Nikaya, in the Nidana Samyutta. And this is an important philosophical statement and an underpinning of Buddhist thought. Basically, it is a declaration of causality. And this, and it almost too, at first glance, it may appear almost trivial or obvious, this being that exists, through the arising of this, that arises, so forth. But as we study the Buddhist teachings, it's often important to get an understanding, is to put it in the context of Indian thought, which of course was the milieu in which the Buddha was living and teaching, was ancient India at a certain time and place, which had a very diverse and robust philosophical tradition already by the Buddha's time. And by laying out this statement, he was declaring that things arise according to causes and conditions and not otherwise. That is to say, a denial of randomness or arbitrariness. And we see this this statement's importance in one of the functions of the dependent origination, or one of the purposes for expounding it, was as a middle path, and it's explicitly declared to be the middle path between the two extreme views. And what are the extreme views? They are Sasattavada, eternalism, and Uchedavada, annihilationism. And there were teachers in India who expounded variations of both of these views, and we can see them elaborated several times in the suttas, most notably in the Brahmajala Sutta, the first sutta of the Digha Nikaya. And we still see variations of these views at the present day. Sasatawada eternalism is the view that a living being has an eternal, unchanging essence. In the Indian context, this was the Atman, or Pali Atta. So thus we have the Buddhist denial of this in the Anattawada, the not-self view. And sometimes also in some versions of Indian thought, it was called Jiva. And this is how the Jains called it, the living entity inside the perishing body. In later times in the West, it would be called a soul. That there is some unchanging, imperishable essence in human beings. And in the Indian version, the Atman, we see this expounded very clearly in the Bhagavad Gita, which many scholars think was, at least in part, a deliberate critique or refutation of the Buddhist view, because it is a post-Buddhist scripture, and it takes this view of the Atman and expounds it in part with the analogy that the Atman is like, the Atman passing from lifetime to lifetime is like a man waking up in the morning and putting on a fresh suit of clothes. And the suit of clothes represents the body, that the man waking up is the Atman. The Sasatawada view is usually, almost always, associated with the idea of a creator God, as the big Atman. The opposite view is the Uchedawada view, which is the Annihilationist view. The modern version of that is materialism or physicalism. And there were teachers who expounded this in India at the Buddhist time, that the only thing that is real and actual is the physical form of the human body. And at death, it just returns to the four elements, and there's no continuation of consciousness of any sort. So it's entirely a mechanistic view. The idea of consciousness arising as a secondary effect of physicality. In the modern iteration, that would be the idea that the complexity of brain function allows consciousness to arise. Now, these two views, although in the world they're often adversaries, and we see that, in modern times, that everyone's familiar with the antipathy between atheists and theists. One iteration of this is creationism versus evolutionism. And we see this in the world all the time. So these views see themselves as polar opposites, irreconcilable. But from the Buddhist point of view, in the middle path, they share a singular error. Each has a version of denying, at some point in their explanations, they deny this law of causality. Things arise according to causes and conditions, not otherwise. In the eternalist view, there is a dependence in the explanation on the arbitrary will of a creator. You can trace causality only so far back, and then you have the first cause, which is the creator of the universe, and this is, of course, in God in Western religion. Brahma in India, but there's no law of causality that applies to God. God is the creator and his will is arbitrary. So causality is denied at this point. In the annihilationist view, there must necessarily be an element of randomness involved that denies causality. This can be explained in terms of the particular characteristics of beings. We have in the world a wide range of possibilities of states of existence. We could be even without getting into invisible realms. There are on this earth, there are human beings and many species of animals. And even amongst human beings, there's a wide range. Some are born healthy, some are born sickly, some are born male, some are born female. There's an endless variety just within human beings. Now, the physicalist view can explain to some degree the mechanism of this. For example, we say that a person is born male if they have XY chromosomes and female if they have XX chromosomes, and the mechanisms of that can be explained. But it cannot approach the question of why one being is born with some particular characteristic and others not. For example, somebody is born with a serious birth defect, let's say Down syndrome. So the physical mechanism of that might be explained in terms of genetics or accidents in the womb, but the question of why Joe is born healthy and normal and Tim has been born with Down syndrome, to the materialist, that's not even a relevant question. They cannot even understand that. To the eternalist, the answer is very difficult as well, because they have to say, well, God did it. Well, what kind of a God would create someone deliberately with Down syndrome? But the Buddhist view, independent origination, looks for causality always. Like, what is the reason? What is the cause and condition? And the answer, which we will in subsequent talks, I will get into the mechanics of dependent origination and how that applies to rebirth. But the simple answer is that karma made in a past life determines the characteristics you were born with. That there is no accidents, there is no chance, there's no arbitrary assignment of characteristics by a deity. It's determined by actions done in previous lifetimes. So this law of causality is universal and irrevocable, and inescapable. There is cause and effect. It's a principle in Abhidhamma that nothing arises without a cause, and nothing arises from a single cause, meaning that there's a multiplicity of causes that account for every every event, every occurrence. There's one of the heresies that the Buddha denounced was the idea that everything is caused by karma, and this has caused this, because the Buddha denied this as a principle. It doesn't mean that he was opening the door to randomness. And I have seen some modern misinterpretations of this idea. All this means is that karma is only one cause of an event amongst others. There's a explication of this in the commentaries, and when they talk about the four niyamas, four principles of causation, one of which is kama niyama, one of which is dhamma niyama, which in the dhamma in this case means natural law. There's uju niyama, which is utu niyama, which is temperature, literally. Well, it means like climate or larger geological forces, meteorological and geological forces. And Bijnaniyama, seed law, which is genetics. So there is always an interplay between different factors in causing any event. Was it like 10 or 15 years ago when there was that horrible tsunami that killed many thousands of people in Asia? And I gave a public talk some place in Toronto not long after that event, and there were many Asian people in the audience. And one Sri Lankan woman asked me after, in the question and answer period, she turned the topic around to the tsunami, and she asked, I'm struggling to understand how the law of karma applies to people dying in the tsunami. And I thought about it, how it could work, and my reply was that the tsunami itself had nothing to do with karma. It's a natural law. It's geological process, the movements of the earth plates. So that's dhamma niyama and utu niyama. And whether human beings are present or not, no matter what they did, this earthquake would have occurred and the tsunami would have occurred. But then thousands of people died, and this is to back up a little bit here to make another important point. According to Abhidhamma, every sense experience that we have is classed as karma resultant, meaning that karma is a factor in everything we experience. So the interplay of karma and other causes creates an experience or an event. So in the case of this tsunami, all the people who drowned have lived, as we all have, they've lived multiple, countless lifetimes in the past, and they must have had made at some point in their long career in samsara, they must have made the karma that would result in death by drowning, perhaps suffocating beings. So they may have borne this karma for many, many lifetimes, and the physical contribution to the event did not arise, so it did not give the karma an opportunity to come to fruition. But when there is a tsunami, then now this karma has an opportunity to come to fruition, and they experience death by drowning. And whenever there's an event like this, afterwards there are stories about people who seemingly miraculously escaped. Like, say, a man decides that morning, for no reason at all, today would be a good day to go hiking up in the hill country, which maybe he hasn't done for years, but he decides just out of the blue that morning he's going to do it, because that man did not have the karma to die by drowning. And the kind of an interesting reaction I got from making this explanation, some of the Westerners in the crowd objected. They don't like the sound of that because it sounds to them like blaming the victim. Whereas a number of the Asian people came up to me afterwards and told me, "Thank you, Ajahn. I really appreciate what you said about the tsunami. That put my mind at ease. Now I understand it, where I was troubled before." So this is an example, a kind of a long digression I gave here, is an example of how the laws of causality, and particularly karma, can be misunderstood, or held in a wrong way. And when we examine the specific dependent origination in detail, we'll look at how this applies to the law of karma and the process of rebirth. But this is an important point to hold in mind, that these laws are not personal. They're not a judgment on a being. They're a natural process, an unfolding of causality, of cause and condition. There is no deity that is imposing karma as a reward and punishment. There is a simple result of action. Another issue that people have with understanding karma is that if they come from a materialist or mechanistic background, they have difficulty accepting that karma could possibly work. They don't see the mechanism for it. And this misunderstanding comes from a adherence to the materialist view. Whereas in Buddhism, the principle is that mind is not only an independent factor, but it is the chief factor. As it said in the very first verse of the Dhammapada, mind comes before the body. Mind is the chief, mind is the forerunner, just as the ox comes before the cart. And this seems difficult to accept for someone whose presupposition is materialist. But it's actually not far from some understanding of modern physics. The idea that in quantum physics that reality exists only as a wave function, a probability function. and that it only is determined as an actual point or an event when some observation is made. And this has been interpreted in different ways, but one way of understanding this is that the wave function of quantum mechanics is like the sunyata. It's the full emptiness, to use a turn of phrase that's found in Tibetan Buddhism, that before anything is manifest, there is a universal potentiality. Because it's empty, because of the great emptiness, then there's universal possibilities. But as soon as something comes into manifestation, then it's like a broken fragment, it's like a shard. This is one meaning, I think, of dukkha, that that which is actual, that which is manifested, has lost that universal potential, and now only is as it is, and it's subject to cause and condition. So this idea of causality cuts into the very, or penetrates into the very nature or fabric of reality. And the interdependency of dhammas, of the actual momentary events, is part of their innate characteristic. Another phrase that is found in Tibetan teachings is nothing exists from its own side. There is no event or dhamma that exists as a complete standalone entity, self-sufficient, self-existent. It only exists as a momentary intersection of forces, which ultimately includes the entirety of reality. So everything is dependent on other things, and multiply dependent in different directions. So we have this principle of causation. This principle of causality is very central and key to understanding the nature of samsara, of manifest or existent reality. But the Buddha's teaching is not intended primarily as a philosophical explanation. It has a pragmatic purpose always, to lead beings out of suffering. And all his teachings are directed to that end. So and as he said in Sutta, that what he taught is like the leaves in his hand, but what he could teach is like the leaves in the forest, and that what he teaches is that which is useful or profitable for the well-being of the listener, and ultimately to lead them to the unconditioned, to lead them out of suffering into nibbana. So he must have had this purpose in expounding the dependent origination, that this is useful for us to know. This is to help us to escape from samsara. And having that universal principle of causality,
It's 8 o'clock,
which can be called the general principle of dependent origination, he goes on to expound the 12 nidanas, or stages or links of the specific dependent origination, the paticca samuppada. And this is the the version that probably most of you are somewhat familiar with, beginning with ignorance and going through all the stages leading to birth, sickness, old age, and death. And the Buddha said he gave this as an explanation for how this whole mass of suffering comes to be. And it has a very central place in his teaching. He said that he who sees the dependent origination sees the Dhamma. In other words, the Dhamma is the dependent origination. This is the teaching. It's the on par with the Four Noble Truths. In fact, the dependent origination really serves as a detailed exposition, particularly of first and second noble truth. First truth is that there is dukkha. Second truth is that dukkha is caused by tanha or craving. And the dependent origination goes into some detail of how this process actually plays out. And it also, when taken in reverse order with the cessation of factors, it covers the third noble truth as well. And the fourth noble truth serves as a practical guide for realizing this. But the 12 nidanas of the usual formula of the dependent origination basically covers, in the way it's presented in the forward order, it basically covers the nature of samsara. There is a variation which we will get into later in the Upanishad Sutta that shows the branching off from that samsaric process leading to liberation, leading to the unconditioned, and breaks that down into stages as well, or its own set of nidanas. Basically, any natural process we could name, whether it's biological processes or physical processes, can be broken down into stepwise nidanas, explanation. Because of this, that arises. Because of that having arisen, then the third thing arises, and so on. So in mathematical terms, it would be an algorithm. We do have to have some caution in oversimplifying the process of the 12 nidanas, dependent origination, to see it too simplistically as a one step leading to another in a stepwise fashion. That is kind of that's the superficial view that gives you an entrance into the conception. But we have to remember the principle that nothing arises from a single cause. So what we're talking about here with the because of ignorance, karma formations, because of karma formations, rebirth, consciousness, etc. We're looking at the most important or dominant cause in the matrix of causes. In each particular event, there is a multiplicity of causes, but breaking it down to looking at the predominant causes can give us an understanding of how things work in a more general way. And there are some points in the dependent origination that have very practical applications for life and for spiritual development. particularly, and I will get into this in later in the series, but just to anticipate here, the link between feeling and craving, the Vedana and Tanha, is extremely important for practice. Now, when one is conscious or mindful of one's feelings, then it's possible to not go into craving. But once craving has occurred in the mind, then it's very much more difficult to break the continual ongoing process of the cycle. So this is often pointed to by teachers as a critical point for awareness. This is one of the main themes of Ajahn Buddhadasa's teachings, for example. So when we get into the details of dependent origination, we should try, and it's inevitable, it's going to be somewhat technical or abstract, but bear in mind that it's not just a interesting theory. It's given specifically as a guide to understanding the mind for the practical purpose of liberation. And seeing things in this way is an important part. This is right view, seeing things as arising from cause and conditions and not otherwise is an important aspect of right view, and establishes one on the path. So I'll stop with my formal remarks at this time, and I'll answer questions. And I see looks like there's some already in the chat. So is that how do we do this?
Andamayang Dhammakataya Sadhukarang Dadamase. Sadhu, 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 anumodami. Thank you so much for your talk, Ajahn. I really enjoyed it. And yes, there are a few questions in the live chat, so I will highlight them so you can see them on the screen. And the first question is from Bobby. And
okay. Oh, that's yeah.
I will read out the question and then you can answer them. So they ask, the Big Bang being dependently arisen, will everything along with dependent origination come to an end,
okay,
to impermanence?
Okay. Well, it's important to recall the Buddha's admonition that the beginnings of samsara cannot be known; they're beyond speculation. And this was, the Buddha was very dismissive, really, of discussions of such questions, because it's really we can't know the beginnings of samsara. But it was the Buddhist tradition later, after the Buddhist time, began to lean very strongly towards the proposition that samsara is without a beginning. And this was in fact explicitly stated by Buddhaghosa. And I think it's not unreasonable, because it is a logical conclusion if we accept the first premise of the axiom of the dependent origination, that everything arises from a cause. So this would mean that no matter how far back you go in time, there to some moment X, there's going to be a moment X minus 1. And there's no possibility of ever finding a first beginning because there wasn't any. So to take it into modern cosmological speculation, a Big Bang model is only one possibility. There's some strong evidence for it, but it's not. It's still just a theory based on observation of background radiation and so on, and the apparent movement of the galaxies according to measurements of the redshift. But it's certainly not a proven idea. And one version of the Big Bang theory holds that the universe will eventually contract again to a point, and then there will be a new Big Bang and a new universe arising out of that. So we don't know. This is all speculation. But if there was a singular one-time event of a Big Bang, that doesn't seem like it would be really accountable for in any philosophical system that depended on causality. Okay, so maybe we go on to the next question.
Okay, Ajahn, thank you. The next question is from Dhammajiva, and they ask, would the Ajahn then define Nibbana as that open potentiality that he alluded to earlier?
Perhaps that could be one way of understanding it, that the fundamental division is between the conditioned and the unconditioned. The Nibbana as the unconditioned, asankata, is the only thing that's beyond this law of causality. Nibbana is neither cause nor is it a cause of anything else. This is somewhat different than the concept of sunyata, although they're certainly parallel in some ways. Sunyata is in some respect at least more all-encompassing than Nibbana, because every Dhamma in manifest existence is also empty. It has no self-substance. And Nibbana is also empty. So emptiness applies to both the conditioned and the unconditioned. But when in Nibbana, or the unconditioned, I'd hesitate in some respect to call it a potentiality, because it, as long as we don't assume that Nibbana is somehow the cause of samsara, then we could see it. The definition you're using here could apply with that that qualification. Okay, going on.
Oh, sorry. The next question is from Dinku, and they ask, can you talk a bit more about the relationship between the Noble Eightfold Path and dependent origination? Thank you.
Well, the Noble Eightfold Path is a program for guiding our actions with body, speech, and mind towards skillful ends. So it's using that principle of karmic formations in a skillful way. So it is a expression, by following the Eightfold Path, we are living an expression of causality. That this is the cause of good results in the future, ultimately leading to liberation. So it's the application of those stages of the dependent origination, beginning with karmic formations. That because of karmic formations, then our rebirth consciousness will go into a suitable place, and we'll have good opportunities in the future, ultimately leading to liberation with the Noble Eightfold, the final steps of the Noble Eightfold Path, right energy, right mindfulness, and a right samadhi that will lead us out of the round of rebirth. Okay.
Okay, so Dhammajiva has a follow-up question, and they ask, ignorance, independent origination, is the lack of knowledge of the Four Noble Truths. What is it that is ignorant? What is it that dwells in Nibbana? I have always struggled with this. Thank you.
There's no it. There's no it that is ignorant. There's only ignorance. There's no it that dwells in Nibbana. There's only Nibbana. And this is, I'm not trying to be dismissive. This is you're touching on really a core point of understanding. Once you abandon the view of a self, of an agent in the process, then these things become more evident. This is part of why we look at the dependent origination, because we can understand the process in terms that does not require the existence of a self. It doesn't require an agent. There is karma and result, but there's no actor doing it, or there's no agent receiving the result. There's just action and result. So next.
The next question is from Power of Love. And they say, thank you for the talk, Ajahn. Could you shed some light on the different translations of nama and which would be the most useful in practice? I've read nama, I've read name, mind, and prototype.
Okay. Well, I haven't seen prototype before for nama. That's interesting. Nama literally means name. But it's a kind of a non-literal use of the term. It's explained in the sutta itself, dealing with dependent origination. It's explained that the nama refers to the non-physical aggregate, so it's mind. The mind is really what is meant here. So nama rupa is mind and body.
Okay, thank you, Ajahn. The next question is from RB. Is it true then that every particle observable phenomenon was born out of some kind of craving?
Ultimately, yes. I mean, that's not completely evident, but in an ultimate sense, that is true. That the universe exists, or physical manifestation exists, because of craving, because we're doing it. It's like something we choose moment by moment. It's one of the points of dependent origination, is that the two root factors is different stages in the dependent origination, or different places in the explanation, are ignorance and craving, and they're paired. They go together very much. If you were not ignorant, you wouldn't have craving. And that's because of craving that you're ignorant. And this craving is what keeps us in existence. Is what keeps samsara happening. In each moment, the mind has a craving to take an object.
Okay, thank you,
So
Ajahn.
perhaps,
Sorry.
I'm just going to add one more point to that. Perhaps we can look at it that it's the process of tanha that collapses the wave function. Okay, go to the next question.
There's another follow-up question from Dhammajiva, which is ignorance a Dhamma then, like any other Dhamma?
Well, it is. It depends really how, in what sense you're using the word Dhamma. And in this, it is a Dhamma in I guess it is in strict Abhidhamma terms, because it's one of the sankharas that are, or the chitasakas that are listed. So, as in the form of amoha, or sorry, not amoha, in the form of moha. That there is a so it is a dhamma, although it's not. That doesn't mean it's an entity. It's a possible object of consciousness. If Dhamma is defined in that way, then it would be.
Okay, the next question is from Ayasoma here, and she asks, the 12 links are presented as a sequential chain. Is it correct to see the links as interlinked with each other?
Yes, it is and if you go through the Nidana Wagga of the Samyutta Nikaya, you'll see some variations on the standard sequence. One that comes up is, for example, consciousness and name and form, Vijnana Nanarupa, mutually dependent. And this also occurs in the Digha Nikaya, that in the sequential chain, we say that because of Vijnana Namarupa, but it can also be seen that Vijnana is also a product of Namarupa. So that they reinforce each other. They're co-arising, mutually dependent. So there are different relationships between the nidanas, other than a sequential chain, which is what I alluded to by saying, not to take it too simplistically, but the sequential chain, that's the usual presentation that occurs most often in the suttas, is the kind of predominant factors, the general unfolding of things is best understood, at least at first approach, by going through the 12 in sequential order. But that doesn't preclude other relationships between the factors.
The next question is from M, and they ask, does the Buddha have anything to do with the question, why is there something rather than nothing? This question scares me because in the end it always leads to God. Thank you, Ajahn.
Well, this is exactly what the dependent origination is addressing. That this is why there is something, is because of ignorance and craving. If it wasn't for ignorance and craving, there'd be no manifestation. That basically, that we could say that the universe is a mistake. It arises out of ignorance and craving.
Okay, thank you, Ajahn. The next question is from Aum, and they ask, Ajahn, can you please speak a bit to birth and death in this life, every moment in the here and now as a result of causality?
Yeah, that's certainly applicable. And I was planning to address this in later on in the series. But I'll give a brief answer now. The standard interpretation, which is well established in the commentaries and has the strongest support in the suttas, is the so-called three lives model that requires you to understand past, present, and future lives within the dependent origination. But it's also mentioned even by Buddhaghosa in the Visuddhimagga that the whole thing can be interpreted as happening at in different timescales in a single moment. We're coming into birth as an existent being and then passing away in the next moment when we take a different object. So the thing is they're not mutually exclusive interpretations. It's the same principles operating on different scales.
So the next question is from Wheelbarrow Friend, and they ask, why is existing marked by suffering, impermanence, and no self? Why structured like that instead of being arbitrary?
Because it really can't be any other way. That it's not like a choice is made. It's not like a deliberate thing. It's just that's the nature of reality. If something is manifest, then it's inherently going to be dukkha because it's incomplete. It's imperfect. It's just a fragment, and it can't exist for more than a moment, and it has no substantiality. It has no self essence. That's just a fundamental nature of manifestation. That the way to look at it is the difference between emptiness and well, everything is actually empty, but the difference between pure or potential, pure potentiality of the ultimate emptiness and the limitedness of a single dhamma, an occurrence. There's no possible way it could be complete.
Okay, thank you, Ajahn. Dhamma Jiva has a comment and a follow-up question, and they say, Ajahn, it is incredibly valuable to be able to hear your wisdom and insights. Thank you so much. And then they ask, in the Gandhava intermediate state, after death, do all the 5 aggregates from the prior life continue? Thank you.
The whole discussion around the Gandhava is a very uncertain one. There's a lot of different interpretations of this. Let's say the commentarial explanation that we find in, for example, the Visuddhimagga and the commentaries denies that there is any intermediate state at all, that the last moment when you die is succeeded immediately by the first moment when you're reborn. And the Gandhava is just merely a kind of poetic or metaphorical expression for consciousness arising again. But that's not very satisfying. Why would the Buddha have even mentioned the Gandhava seeking rebirth? This is the phrase that when a new being begins, it's the blood of the mother in her season, the seed of the father, and the Gandhava seeking rebirth, the 3 elements coming together. The issue is complicated because the word Gandhava is also used for a class of lesser deities, lesser devas, the musicians generally. and the root of Gandhabba is Gandha is to smell, or to sense by the nose. And there's no real adequate explanation of Gandhabba in the Pali scriptures. There is a passage in the Abhidharma Kosha, which is a Sarvastivadin book, that describes the Gandhabba as the state of after death, in which the being is like a little spirit, or like a fairy that flies around and lives off scents, the scents of flowers and scents of trees, and seeks out its place of rebirth. So it travels physically from where it died to where it's going to be reborn. So this is an uncertain question. It's not well explained and there are divergent traditions on it. It's very common in let's say folk Buddhism, or the beliefs of people in Buddhist countries, that there is some kind of intermediate state. That I don't think too many people other than hardcore Abhidhamma scholars accept the commentarial tradition that there's immediate rebirth without any intermediate state. As for the five aggregates, I wouldn't think that their five aggregates continue in the Gandhabba directly. Certainly, the body cannot continue. That there's it would the Gandhabba is probably best understood as a kind of a very temporary intermediate state of being, as a kind of a temporary birth into a ghostly existence before taking a physical form in a new state. But this is a question that actually books have been written about this, and it's something that's not settled. Okay.
Yeah, they have a follow-up comment, and they say the suttas mention enlightenment occurring after death and before landing in the next life. I think that refers to your point about many people not accepting that there is no intermediate state.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's a good point to raise. And this is an argument that's often brought up to counter the commentarial view that there's immediate rebirth. There has to be some time elapsed between death and birth if enlightenment is going to occur before the rebirth.
Okay, Ajahn, I think that was the last question so far. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's a real pleasure. We are so fortunate to have you today. And I think you could see from all the questions that we were having that people were so happy to have you. And also to be able to have somebody who we can ask all these deep questions to, because that's difficult to find somebody who can answer these kind of questions. So I think hopefully I can speak for everybody when I say that we were really fortunate to have you. And thank you so much for joining us. And we're all looking forward to next week when you give the next talk about dependent origination. So thank you so much for joining us. And we will end as usual with 3 sadhus. And everybody, I invite everybody who's listening to join in. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you so much, Ajahn, and see you next time.
Okay, very good. I enjoyed it. Bye now.